It's touted as a bold experiment in city building, promising a new kind of neighborhood enabled by data, artificial intelligence, and robots. Spearheaded by the biggest tech player there is, Google's parent company, in partnership with Waterfront Toronto, the Quayside project will occupy 12 acres of underutilized land on the east side of the harbour in Ontario's capital city. Is this good news or too good to be true? Let's find out. We'll ask Anne Kavukian, distinguished expert in residence at Ryerson University's Privacy by Design Centre of Excellence, Christopher Hume, columnist for the Toronto Star and real estate blog torontostories.com, and Bianca Wiley, an open government advocate and associate at Open North. And it's so good to have all of you, in your case, back here in this studio.
Thank
and you,
you,
I think, for the first time here.
Indeed.
Great to have you here.
Thank you.
And I want to just spend a bit of time with you off the top here to get a sense of the history of this project. How did it come together?
Well, it's interesting. I was contacted a few months ago by Sidewalk Labs. They're based in New York. And they said, we're bidding on this project for Quayside, Waterfront Toronto. And we're going to build a great smart city if we get the contract. And we want to make sure privacy is embedded by design into the project. And I said, oh, privacy by design, that's my creation. And they said, that's why we're contacting you. I said, great. I said,
so you were encouraged to hear that right away.
I was, but I also said to them, and these were my words, I said, look, are you sure you want to get me for this? Because I'll be a thorn in your side. I will insist upon privacy being embedded into every step of this project.
And that didn't scare them off?
Apparently not, because they keep coming back. So that's how it started.
And do you know how they ultimately got the contract?
I do not. They bid on it, so that was with the City of Toronto. That I don't know.
Do we know who's paying for it?
Sidewalk Labs is paying for the part that they got the contract to do.
Do we know how much?
10 million US, as high as 50 million US. And let's just say something here, Steve. It goes back actually to 2001 when Waterfront Toronto was formed, and its mandate, the tripart organization's mandate, was to revitalize the waterfront, 2,000 acres from the far west end to the east end. And they've done a lot, in that meantime. They've done a good job. And I think that we have to keep in mind at all times during this conversation that it's not just about Google or Sidewalk Labs, but that Waterfront Toronto is involved. They are the gatekeeper.
What's the significance of that distinction?
Well, because I think the conversation has been very much about Google. This is Google's Trojan horse through which, they're going to come and take over the city. And I think that that is somewhat overstated. These fears are kind of exaggerated, I think. And I think that we're going to have to trust Waterfront Toronto again. But having covered them for God knows how many years, I am confident in them. I'm confident that they're going to have the experience to do a good job. And I think that the reason that Sidewalk Labs got the contract was because they came up with the best proposal. And even though there are going to be lots and lots of issues, and I'm sure we'll talk about them, I think that because Waterfront Toronto was part of it, because they are urbanists before they're technologists, this is something that we should be excited about.
Are you as confident?
No.
Tell me why.
Well, a few reasons. I think the first thing for me is that we're talking about how we can do this with Google, and personally, I would prefer that we're talking about different ways to do this, period.
Without Google?
Correct. You could do this many different ways, and I think assuming and sort of working into the conversation that they've set up about what are their concerns with Google, and just talking about that, we miss the chance to talk about other ways to use technology. So I love technology. There's a lot we can do with it. And I think we need to explore those as well. And that means that we change the conversation and we make it a bigger conversation.
Before we change that conversation, he said Google made the best bid, Alphabet made the best bid, therefore they should have got it. There will be watchdogs, I guess, if you like Waterfront Toronto, and we have a privacy person here to make sure that everything goes according to Hoyle. Why isn't that good enough?
Technology, big tech particularly, they are way ahead of the government in terms of understanding technology, working on technology, coming up with solutions, and most importantly, figuring out ways to make money using technology, right? So to have somebody like the government, all three levels of government, sort of being in charge of this thing, I would not say that they're as up to speed as Google is with its intentions. And so there's a bit of a challenge there in terms of how this is set up from the hop.
And Bianca, if I can, it's not like I have great trust in government either, but what we hope to do, what I hope my role will be, is embedding privacy protective measures into the design of what they're proposing. So who approves the design will be the city and others. But in terms of the ability to track citizens, to engage in surveillance with the technology that they're proposing, that's not going to happen. And that I can provide that assurance.
That's personal level privacy. And what I'm talking about is beyond the personal level privacy, like data related to a person, is aggregate data. Because a lot of the stuff in their plan isn't about particulars of one person's data. It's how the city's working, where people are using things, what the transportation flow is like.
Why is that of concern?
Because if a company is taking that data and using it to build products and services to then sell back to us, why isn't that intellectual property and the value of that data ours as residents of this city? And why is the government not the one who can reap the benefits of having that and can build solutions out from there? And not just the government. I'm saying technology and firms in technology, yes, but working with a large company that works and deals in proprietary solutions is not the only way to work with the private sector.
Let me just do a quick follow-up here. If they want to expend the energy and resources and whatever to find out how many people in this new neighborhood are going to cycle versus take a streetcar versus walk versus take a car, actually, they can't take a car. There's no driving there. Well, why do we care?
Because why don't we want that information? Why don't we want our government?
As in to own it?
Yes, and to have access to it.
Ann and then Chris.
And maybe the city can negotiate that. I don't know the kind of discussions they have. I know that for the first year, it's all in the planning stage. So ask the city, pressure the city to work on those kind of issues that are important. From my perspective, my role in this is to ensure that personally identifiable data associated with individuals who live in the area, citizens, that remains protected. And that is vital because we don't want this to become a tracking exercise where your comings and goings and everything else, all that data is collected and then used in any kind of surveillance notion. That to me is the greatest fear, and that we can ensure will be avoided.
Christopher.
Well, I think there are a couple of issues. First of all, Waterfront Toronto is not the government. It is responsible to the three levels of government, but it was deliberately created by those three levels in order to provide an arm's length distance from all three of them. And I would say that over the years, the whatever 17 years that it's existed, it has dealt with technology in a way that the rest of the city has not. I mean, the East Bayfront has the high-speed internet already. If you buy a unit there as a residential or commercial, you buy into this existing network. So I think these people, and I'm not here to shill for Waterfront Toronto, but I do think that the city isn't up to speed on high tech. No doubt about that. But I think these guys probably are. And I think that's the whole point of Waterfront Toronto. And second of all, the big question really is, how does Sidewalk Labs think it's going to make money from this thing? Because they're not here out of the goodness of their hearts. We know that. And the data is one thing. But frankly, if I'm from Sidewalk Labs and I'm here to make a buck, I think there are probably better ways to do it. And I think that their real issue, their real intention is to come up with services, techniques, things that they can either take out that they can own, intellectual property they can own or share with the city, and that's how they'll apply them to other cities, and that's how they'll make their money.
It's a huge laboratory for them in some respects, isn't it?
And that's what it is. This is the testing ground. This is an experiment. It might succeed, it might fail. We don't know yet. But the details, as Anne said, the details of their contract takes them no further than a year. If we don't like it, we can say no and say thank you very much, thanks, but no thanks.
Does that satisfy you?
No, for several reasons. I want to come back. I think one thing, the privacy issue, to me, is almost a red herring because they've owned it off the hop. As part of their PR is saying, we know you're worried about surveillance and privacy. We're on it, don't worry about it. And that's one issue, but in the background is this market-making exercise. They are looking for new markets. Governments have budgets, and they are going to look for ways to sell things to our governments, our municipal governments and global municipal governments. So the challenge with that to me is this the best way to be spending money with a firm like Google? And they have a very proprietary, they have a large platform right? So they're going to be thinking of ways to keep money and services moving within their very large company. And yes, we can buy things from the private sector that are technology products, but are these the ones that we want to be buying? And are these the ones that we want to be supporting their R&D?
So in your view, we have to be more than just wary. We ought to, in fact, have canceled this thing and just reimagine the whole thing.
We haven't had a discussion nationally about the impacts of putting data out there. How are we ready to be the test bed for a year for a company like this? We're not ready for that. We haven't had discussions about those services.
Isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that? I mean, nobody has. This is a unique experiment in the globe.
Okay.
And what I have to tell you on the privacy issue, you're treating that as a given, that it's going to be addressed. Look globally. Smart cities have led to surveillance, clear path to surveillance where they've been done. So this is going to be completely different from the norm. This is going to set us apart from the way smart cities have been developed elsewhere. And that's the whole point, is that we can shine, at least in terms of the privacy and data protection associated with this smart city. We can be a leader in that.
When you say smart city, what do you mean specifically? What do you mean?
Technology being used in ways to accelerate services, facilitate facilitate transportation measures, planning, infrastructure, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And it's happening all over the world, and it has been noted for its surveillance capacity everywhere. That's why we stand quite apart. When this was publicized and my name has been associated with in terms of privacy by design, you wouldn't believe the number of contacts I've had from other jurisdictions saying, wow, we've got to try to do that here. Keep us posted on what you're doing. So it sets us apart from the others. Whether it's appropriate or not in terms of the development and the relationships with government, et cetera, I can't speak to that. But I can speak to the privacy issue as being distinctive and one that we can take pride in.
You were Information and Privacy Commissioner for the province of Ontario for 15 years? How many
17.
years? 17
3
years.
terms.
3 terms. Like, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good housekeeping seal of approval if Ann Cavoukian is on the case, don't you think?
Well, I do, and that's why I'm saying that's not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is, and all the stuff you're saying about Waterfront Toronto, they've been really good stewards of the waterfront. But it's what's going on here in terms of market making, okay? Innovation, you say innovation, and everybody at all level of government right now is, let's do it, let's do it,
Yeah.
let's do it, right? And so what kind of products are our governments looking for? They're looking for things that are going to increase efficiencies, right? They're going to be looking for ways to do things better, smarter, faster, whatever, which, not necessarily bad, but we have other issues in our cities. Like, let's go all the way out here and talk about prioritization. Is AI and technology going to help us have a more equitable city? Is it going to be resolving, like Sidewalk Labs was on stage at a public meeting talking about affordability. And in my mind, I'm thinking, why is it?
I mean, it seems to me that we're focusing overly on the issue of privacy. One of the things that I thought was most interesting about their proposal is this whole notion of modular construction.
What does that mean, Christopher?
That means that they basically build a building off-site, assemble it somewhere down on the Quayside, and their idea seems to be that they would build generic space. It's like, to me, it seems like a 21st century version of a 19th century warehouse. A building that can be a factory one generation, an office the next, and then a condo. That it's just space that can be used and reused and reused. Flexibility is built into the structure. Yes, and they can reduce the costs. And this is not unique. This idea is not new with them. It's been talked about many times before, but the idea is that they can reduce the cost of construction, make housing more affordable. Dan Doctoroff has talked about...
This is the former deputy mayor of New York City.
Correct, and the CEO of Sidewalk Labs. He's talked about, he thinks that he can reduce, or I should say, they can reduce the cost of transit $6,000 a year per family. Now, who were the other people who were bidding on responding to this request for proposals? You know, it's the usual suspects, the large developers, the big pension funds, those kinds of institutions, and they're obviously there to make a buck too, but they're there to make a buck in the same old way that we have seen 1,000 times in this city. This proposes something different. Now, the real issue is going to be what happens when they go to the city, not to Waterfront Toronto, and say, we want to build differently. We want to to do it in a whole new way, then it's, are you kidding? You can't do that. So that's when the problem's going to come.
Okay, that's a separate issue aside. Go back. Yeah, I can tell you wanted to dive in on the first issue.
Well, the one thing, like we've had we've had privatization going on. We've had public-private partnerships. Generally speaking, when they happen, all of us as the public understand what a hospital is, what a road is, what transportation is. We don't understand what we're partnering with here.
Do you?
No, I can't know. Is Sidewalk Labs under any obligation to be forthcoming in what they're doing in terms of product development and service development? No.
Yes.
No,
They would ask for transparency. That would be an expectation.
They didn't even release the contract. The board decided, no one would second the motion to release the contract. We're starting as that's our initial opening on transparency as to what's going on here. There's nothing, there can't be commercial sensitivity in that contract yet.
I think there probably can be, and I think that they have. You know, I pointed out in the column how often, when we are considering building a new condo complex, does the president of the development company show up to talk to the neighbors about what they're going to do? They don't. They hire some poor planner or some poor architect who shows up to talk in a church basement about what's happening. These guys, to their credit, I think, are upfront. They have gone on the record, the public record. We've all heard them. No, it's true, Bianca.
Do you have no suspicions about this or concerns yet at all?
You know what my main concern is? That the sterilizing effects of what happens when one corporate entity is in control of developing a large swath of land. It's too easy to resort to, you know, the same architects, the same designers, the same techniques, and so it all starts to look the same. I mean, that was the issue, one of the issues with St. Jamestown. It was the issue with Regent Park. But look at Regent Park, which is being redeveloped right now, as you all know. One developer is doing it. But every building has a different flavor, a different feel, appeals to a different market. So I think if they're conscious of that, they can build, what's the word, you know, variety into what they do.
And let me follow up with you on that. You have spent much of your professional life trying to warn people about companies like Google getting too much power and having too much say over privacy issues in your life. Do you have any concerns about what they're up to here?
The reason I don't have concerns yet, and I want to be fair to Bianca because I don't know, we haven't had actual planning sessions. However, I've spoken to, you know, Dan Doctorow called me the other day, and I made my expectations very clear. I said, we've got to issue a statement very soon on the privacy side, what our expectations are, and what I am calling for in terms of embedding much needed protections into the design of this stuff. We have to do that right from the beginning. I've already sent them my expectations.
Are you prepared to say to them, you can't own the intellectual property that is, what's the right word here, amassed as a result of your doing this thing?
You know, Stephen, what I would tell them is you can't own personally identifiable data that you collect from the sensors and from the other technology that you use. That's what you can't own, and that's what you can't use in personally identifiable form. We're going to get rid of the personal identifiers, thereby eliminating the privacy risks associated with which are associated with personal information.
So the metadata is okay?
Metadata is okay if it's truly metadata, meaning it can't be linked directly or indirectly with individuals.
So is that satisfactory?
Well,
no, you're still not there.
yeah, I'm still not there. But I just want to go back to Christopher's point, because I think one of the things you mentioned about the sterility has been, that's the historical track record of smart cities, is that nothing's really happened that's been stellar or beautiful, or, because there's human elements that make cities wonderful, and I would say those are the ones that make cities work. And often the ways that you plan cities are unplanned, and they're from things and mistakes and not data-driven decisions. So I think that concern from an urban planning perspective is really important to, you know, to heed. But the thing about these guys being out here and up front and on the stage and on the phone and giving out email addresses, this is PR. This company, Google, Alphabet last year is $90 billion in revenue, primarily from advertising. They are now outspending Wall Street, lobbying in Washington on antitrust, essentially, against being regulated. Okay, so the reason Google is here today in the you know, shape and form that it is historically was from, you know, Microsoft got burned on antitrust and they made way for Google, and now Google is very aware of its position and its dominance. I would love to know how much they're spending on PR. Because to me, this stuff isn't just because they're friendly and available. This is not accidental. This is intentional stuff. And everybody that's involved in this project has seen both business and city building. And so to me, this is not a time to think that there's friendly faces going on here without some really, really well thought out, intentional business, strategic things to do.
Okay, fair enough. Let me follow up on the community reaction angle. There are very few new developments that go on in any city where there isn't somebody saying, not in my backyard. How much NIMBYism have you heard related to this thing?
Well, it's in the middle of nowhere, so there hasn't been a whole lot of NIMBYism. There's nothing down there, which is, I think, something else that we might consider, that this is a blank spot. They are taking, I would suggest they're taking, a $90 billion company doesn't necessarily worry too much about 50 million, I suppose. Nevertheless, they don't want to lose money, but they are starting with a blank slate, and they're trying to create something out of nothing.
Okay, but Toronto is so obsessed with being seen as world class.
Yes.
And do you think that the city mothers and fathers are so enamored with the idea that Google wants to come to Toronto that they may let their guard down where it relates to other stuff?
I think Bianca's right about that. We're so anxious that they love us. But you know what? The Americans do love us. And I think that's an interesting thing, because I think that's going to come back to burn them. Because they can say, oh, Toronto is so open to change. Toronto is so this, and Toronto is... Are you kidding? But I read their proposal, and they've done a lot of homework. They know what's going on. They're not sort of coming here as... Yeah. No, it's true. It's true.
She's still rolling her eyes.
No, I'm saying, of course they have. Yeah. Of course they have. They don't come to play, these guys. This is not small town farm league.
No, but Sidewalk Labs was formed in what, 2014 or 2015?
Even more recently.
Pretty new.
Yeah, 17 people on staff or something like that. Yeah. These guys are. My impression is that they're urbanists first and technologists second, and that's an important consideration.
And that's what I would call PR. The whole thing is a PR exercise in terms of, because technology is a tool. It's not a way, it's a thing. It's the people who bring the technology into spaces and use it, right? And I think back to this point that there's one thing I want us to think about more is other ways to do this, right? Governments have lost their internal capacity to use technology, but they're slowly building it back up. There are public servants who know how to use technology. There are underfunded but super committed public servants who know how to use technology to deliver public services. Why are we going to even consider, it's like why constrain them with this kind of stuff? Why don't we give them some chance to sort of help define how this is going to look? And from an employment perspective, in the next 10 years, we're going to have a huge growth in the public service of people who know how to use technology. Mm-hmm. And they know it across every single discipline. That's going to be happening. You're going to have people who work in every ministry who are quite comfortable with technology. And that's how sort of public stuff first we should be thinking. And technology is sort of a tool underneath. And as far as innovation goes, because we love talking about innovation, it is not innovative to be partnering with basically a monopoly. How is this an innovative strategy? Tons of small to medium-sized companies work in technology, and some of them work with open source stuff. There's ways we could be sharing some of the products that are built across cities. We could save money.
But will they be able to make that, as Christopher points out, empty piece of land with nothing around it bloom in a way that a big multinational like Google can?
I'd like to argue that they can, yes. And Waterfront Toronto, if they're the lead on the urban planning piece and you got tripartite attention being paid, yeah, I think so. If we really want it to be led, why do we need them here? And a second question I have is, the state of our current government IT is not good, right? In terms of the state that it's in. And so there are some other priorities that I think we need to talk about in terms of investing money, because we have a $300 million Smart Cities Fund competition going on now across the country as well. And so we're flying ahead on the Smart Cities topic, but we haven't doubled back and looked at where we're really hurting, where are our systems under a lot of pressure, and where, there's different conversations to have about technology, because the one thing I'll say that tech does, and does it all the time, is it comes at problems with this, it's called tech solutionism. So they come and say, I've got a thing that can do this thing, so let's do this thing. And before anybody's thought about whether that's even the problem, suddenly that's what we're buying. And so I don't want to see that happen to our public service. I don't want to see that now we're buying inventions from Google because they can make money.
Well, let me follow up on that with this. Here's our good friend John Lawrence writing in Spacing magazine from not too long ago. Sheldon, if you would, bring this graphic up. The document espouses changes in transit governance, healthcare delivery, and other domains. It also proposes dramatic changes to the land use and zoning process, recommending an outcomes-based approach that would somehow allow developers to get fast-track approvals by submitting data and other analytics that predicts the impact of their project, emissions, traffic, etc. It may be a good idea. I can't really tell based on the general information provided. But in the context of this proposal, Sidewalk's message is clear. We'll need the runway to be as clear as possible to get this thing going. Christopher.
From the beginning, the model that Waterfront Toronto has followed is that it is the steward of this land. It has pre-planned various precincts. And the reason to do that are twofold. First of all, because you do a better job. You know, they have international competitions to design the East Bayfront, the West Donlands, et cetera, et cetera. So a plan is put in place, and then you call in the developers. And these are the conventional developers, of which we have dozens and dozens in Toronto. They know what is expected of them. They know everything. They know it's 12 stories high, it's residential, mixed with blah, 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 all the rest of that stuff. What does that do? That clears the runway for these guys to come in. They're told it has to be LEED Gold. They're told it has to have this high-speed internet system, et cetera, et cetera. They know all of that. And the reason that they go along with it, because it usually costs them more to build on the waterfront than it does anywhere else, is because the runway is cleared. And they don't have to go through a 2 or 3 year approval process. And that saves them millions of dollars and makes it worthwhile.
But you seemed to suggest earlier that as soon as this far-reaching company from the golden roads of New York City comes up here and runs headlong into our city planning process, that they're going to wish they hadn't. Did I read that right from before?
Well, this is, you know, the Waterfront Toronto's struggle from the beginning, to be blunt, has been against the city. You know, for example, one of Sidewalk's proposals is that utilities would be put underground, so that you don't have garbage trucks coming down the road at 7 o'clock in the morning and bins everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. Everything happens underground. Well, you know, the waterfront wanted to do that, I guess in the 90s or whenever it was. No, not the 90s. Somewhere after, you know, I think in the early 2000s, they were interested in a Swedish system, and you put your garbage in a pneumatic a thing that sucked it into a depot 2 kilometers down the road.
Really?
Really. So the truck only had to go to the depot to collect the garbage. It cleared the streets. You know who turned that down?
No.
The garbage department, because we deal with trucks, not tubes. We don't know anything about tubes, but we know about trucks.
So much for innovation.
As soon as you have the trucks, you need wide streets because they're 50 feet long and they weigh 25 tons, and they, you know, and on and on and on it goes. And when the fire department gets involved, are you kidding? You know, our trucks are 54 feet long, and we need X, Y, Z.
You may be saved at the end of the day by the inertia of the current bureaucracy that is in place in the capital city. Does that make you feel any better? Not yet.
No, but that's the way it works. And that's why Waterfront Toronto, in my opinion, deserves enormous credit, because they have fought this battle at the most mundane, at the most banal level that most of us don't even think about. Like, how wide is a street? How wide, and what's the turning radius? All those kinds of things that would never enter our minds. These are the elements that make up a great city. You know, like everybody loves Cabbagetown. You couldn't build Cabbagetown now. It doesn't meet the bylaws. And on and on and on.
Are they really not going to allow cars down there? Is that right? I mean, I did read that, didn't I?
That's what they say.
The plan is for no cars.
Yeah.
Which
Is that
mind-boggling?
What do we think of that? You say
no,
mind-boggling,
I
but
can't
mind-boggling
imagine.
good or bad?
Well, I mean, you got to have some cars, but that's not my area of expertise. I just want to make sure there's no surveillance.
Right. Self-driving cars, I think, maybe.
But I think it's so ironic that this thing is going to be built in the shadow of the new, bigger and better than ever east end of the Gardiner Expressway. And I think that kind of sums up.
Okay, you have to explain for people who live outside Toronto why what you just said is pretty funny, actually.
Because we had an opportunity, it was unfortunately during the Rob Ford term as mayor, to tear down the East End because it's falling apart, of the Gardner, because it's falling apart. And the city staff...
This is an elevated highway.
The elevated
Could've
highway that
torn it down.
runs through the bottom of the city, west to east. The East End is the quietest part of the Gardner. And the city staff, if you can believe it, recommended that it be torn down because it wasn't worth the money to build it. Again, because it
Which
cost...
is $1 billion.
Yes,
$1 billion
more than
to
$1 billion.
rebuild it, right.
So, of course, you know, our current mayor, whom we love, is basically kind of Rob Ford in disguise. And rather than offend the car lobby and in order not to, you know, further this illusion about the war on the car, we are going to rebuild the East End of the Garden a bit further north. It's true, but it's going to be bigger and better.
At the cost of $1 billion.
Well, it's going to be more than that by the time they finally... And all I'm saying is, like, here we are at this very sort of... Here's where these two impulses, you know, to stick with the old ways, to cling tenaciously to the past, but to enter boldly into the future, are literally going to kind of butt heads. It's going to be interesting to see how that works out.
Do you think Mayors Ford and Tory... you just said John Tory is Rob Ford in disguise? You saying that because they have the same birthday?
No, I'm saying that because they have the same
Isn't that crazy?
agenda.
Yeah. Okay, moving on here. I want to know, and let me get you in on this. There are obviously tons of examples in recent years of a technology that everybody thought was just the cat's pajama, and then, and then it wasn't, right? VHS versus Betamax, and Betamax came in, and now it doesn't even exist anymore, and actually VHS doesn't exist anymore either, pretty much. How do we know that the technology that we're about to dive into here is ultimately the right one?
We have to make sure that it delivers on whatever it's supposed to deliver and, from my perspective, has privacy embedded into the design. I'll give you an example of biometrics. People are, you know, fingerprints, facial recognition, et cetera. You can have biometrics that are highly privacy invasive, or you can have biometric encryption, which is brilliant and uses the unique features of the biometric to encrypt some other data which gets retained, so an actual representation of your biometric template is never retained in the database. It's brilliant technology. That's where we have to have innovation, where you can use the strength of technology, but not in a way that in any way incurs problems with privacy and security. We can do this. You have to be creative, you have to be innovative, but you can do this. Those are the solutions I'm seeking.
How prepared are you to experiment a little bit with this? How much rope do you want to give the city mothers and fathers on this?
In general?
Well, in particular on this case. I mean, it looks like the horse is out of the barn, right? Looks like we're there. This is happening.
Yeah.
Your concerns notwithstanding. How much rope do you want to give them just to sort of see how this goes?
Not much, because we don't know what's going on. Like, again, this goes back to one of the fundamental problems, and we think about civic education and, you know, civic literacy, digital literacy. When we talk about bridges, we understand what we're talking about because we've all seen one and you know, gone across one. When we talk about tech and infrastructure and data, it's abstract, right? So it's really hard for any of us to get our head around this stuff enough to weigh in. And a year sounds like a long time. It's not a long time when you consider how much legislation is out of date and behind all of this technology. A lot of our legislation at all levels of government was written before we started to use products and services like we have now. So we can't expect them to contain and direct, you know, these kinds of things. So that, for me, what's the rush? Why are we rushing?
Can't we press them to be transparent?
Yeah, but transparency doesn't mean that our laws are ready for them. So if they're transparent, and I mean, in a vacuum, if there's no law and there's no policy, this is Lawrence Lessig, 1999, code becomes law. It's what's happening now. We don't have laws for stuff.
We have one law on this program, and that is when the clock says we're done, we're done. And guess what? We're done. I want to thank Bianca Wiley for being on our program today, Open Government Advocate and Associate with Open North. We also want to thank Ann Kavukian, distinguished expert in residence at the Privacy by Design Center of Excellence at Ryerson University, and our good friend Christopher Hume, columnist for the Toronto Star, and you can also catch his blog, torontostories.com. Thanks so much, everybody.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.